The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, this week there was some very big news in the mining front in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As many of you may know from following both our site, our Twitter feed, and our podcast over the past year and a half, actually, there has been a number of standoffs between Chinese mining companies and the Congolese government over mining contracts. Now, there's been two key disputes that have been underway. One is with Gécamines and the Congolese government and the Congolese state-owned mining company Gécamines, and the other one involves the Tenke-Fungurume mine that with China-Mali, otherwise known as CMOC. And in that second one, they reached a landmark deal this week to finally resolve the dispute over royalty payments that has literally blocked over $1 billion of copper and cobalt from leaving the DRC to go to market. Our colleague, Geronima, who is the Francophone editor at the China Global South Project, he's from the DRC. He follows this story more closely than anybody else out there. He's been writing about it for a very long time. He broke the news this week, was one of the first to put it out, and he joins us from Mauritius with the latest. So, Géraud, this was a little bit of a surprise, but at the same time, we got hints that the deal was coming. Finance Minister Nicolas Kazadi, he had indicated at an FT forum that the two sides were getting closer. But tell us a little bit more about what we know at this time of this deal between China-Mali and Gécamines.
So what we know so far is we don't have the specific of the deal. We know that CMOC has put out a statement highlighting the end of the dispute that was between CMOC and Gécamines. So we still don't know how much the details on how the agreement went down on it, but we do know that now the dispute has come to an end, and finally CMOC is going to take back control of Gécamines, because we remember that last year Gécamines has taken Fungurume under administrative control by the justice. But now that the solution is found and the CMOC is going to take back the control of TFM, we're going to have to wait in the coming days and weeks to have the details of the agreement they found between them and Gécamines.
So, Géraud, you mentioned that in the analysis around this deal that there is a move from the Chinese battery maker CATL to become more involved in CMOC's work in the DRC. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what the possible implications of that is.
Yes, CATL took a huge part in the CMOC operation in DRC, specifically in Kinshasa and TFM. So we also do know that CATL is a battery maker in China. So the implication of CATL in that project opened the opportunities that we may see CATL being more involved into helping CMOC to achieve what the Congolese government has been asking for a long time now. We do know that the DRC has been asking to have much more EV battery supply chain built on the ground. So having CATL take part of CMOC operation in the DRC can hint and give us opportunity to see much more that happening on the ground in the coming weeks, even in the coming months, I would say. And let's not forget that CMOC has also, in the statement that he put out, is announced that now he's going to double his production of cobalt and copper out of his operation TFM and Kinshasa. Just it tells you how much we can see much more CATL action on the ground with CMOC and Gécamines.
If you want to hear more about what Géraud is following and his analysis, you can find him both on our site at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, that's the English site, but also at Projet Afrique Chine in French as well. You can sign up for Géraud's newsletter where he is doing all sorts of analysis on this deal, and he is following this very closely. Géraud, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, Cobus, there is one quick, sidebar on this before we get to our discussion, our bigger discussion today, is there are larger geopolitical issues at stake here. So one of the other pieces of news that broke this week following the announcement between CMOC and Gécamines is that President Félix Tshisekedi will be going to Beijing for the first time as president on May 26th, where he will presumably meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And it points to the fact that this relationship between the Chinese and the Congolese government and Gécamines is quite strong and quite robust. And I can imagine in places like Brussels and Washington, they view that as a setback.
I think so, particularly in Washington, I think, because there's been moves from the United States to try and kind of, move into the space of possibly refining metals in the DRC as part of the bigger job to try and kind of remove China from these value chains. So they signed a memorandum of understanding with the DRC and with Zambia to possibly onshore metal refining to those countries. But that MOU is pretty much been sitting dormant since it's been signed. And in the meanwhile, we've seen Chinese companies moving forward quite aggressively with actually locating mineral refining in Africa. Like, depending on what happens with the CMOC and CATL deal, that could be one example, but we're already seeing lithium refining happening in Zimbabwe. So, kind of even on this kind of space that the US has defined, in its competition with China and Africa as the one who's going to locate metal refining to the African continent, it seems like the US is being displaced from that space.
Well, let's step back a little bit from the minutia that we normally cover on this show. So regular listeners will know that we do deep dives on debt, on mining, on the geopolitics of it all. But what we thought we need to do is we need to step back and examine the moment that we're in and try and put all of this into some sort of context. Because one of the pieces of feedback that I get from listeners to the show and followers on the site and the newsletter is that there's so many details. They're having a difficult time kind of putting it into a context. And so we wanted to think of the right person who could help us do that. And through our network, a number of people came and said, you got to talk to Bright Simons. And we are just so thrilled that for the first time on the show, Bright is going to join us. If you're not familiar with Bright's work, he's the founder and president of M Pedigree, a social enterprise working on 3 continents with governments, Fortune 500 companies, activists, and others to safeguard human health and food security using technology. So he's a big tech expert. He's also the vice president in charge of research at an Accra-based think tank in Ghana, the Amani Center for Policy and Education. He's a former member of the Africa Strategy Group for the World Economic Forum. He's a Skoll awardee, a former WEF, World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, a TED Fellow, an Aspen Braddock Fellow, and a former winner of CNBC's African Innovative Business Leader of the Year. I could spend the next half hour going through his credentials, and I wouldn't be done with it, but it's impressive, very, very impressive. And Bright, thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to join us on the show and to help us work through this moment that we're in. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, Eric. Delight to be with you and your audience.
Well, so Bright, we've talked about this mining deal and the implications for the great power competition with the United States. We've been talking a lot about in recent weeks about the debt situation that's affecting your country, Ghana, and at the same time, the inflation crisis that is racking a number of African countries, especially with their depreciating currencies. We're also looking at the technology divide. We're looking at climate change in Africa, the trade deficits with China. I mean, there are so many massive issues that are all coming together at this moment. And I guess I'm very curious to start our conversation with, how are you seeing this moment that we're in? Do you see peril? Do you see opportunity? Let's just start there. Just when you get up in the morning and think about the day ahead, give us a little bit of insight as to where your thoughts go on these issues.
Great. I think, Eric, there's been a period in history where certain illusions no longer can be allowed to persist for too long, and the contradictions that those illusions produce come to a head. So, we're talking about China and the US in Africa, the connection between transition minerals, or some would call them green minerals, rare earth minerals, etc., and climate change and geopolitics. And it's fascinating to see how all of these cycles interweave. And very often what happens is that we forget one debate as the other begins, and the premises of the old debate become the outputs of the new debate. So in simple terms, when I listen to the Chinese mine investment conversation that you just had right now and connect that to geopolitics, the first that came to my mind was this interesting situation where As a result of the transition, the great transition to a post-carbon future, there was a sense that, the geopolitics of natural resources may perhaps become less significant. But that's not what we are seeing, right? We are increasingly seeing that, the competition over lithium, competition over nickel is opening up new vistas of really frightening geopolitical prospects. We have this situation now where China is the producer of almost 95% of rare earth minerals due to intensive investment over many years. And some African countries are slowly becoming important, but one of those is DRC, which for many years has been the site of competition among powers, regional powers for the most part, but increasingly also international powers. So all of a sudden, this transition is no longer geopolitically neutral, right? We are not going to get into a post-carbon future simply because we become more enlightened capitalists. We get there because we have to contest the geopolitical dimensions of this transition. Where are those rare earth minerals that will power green tech? And it's fascinating to see that not much really changes. It's almost as if it's this endless cycle regenerates itself. So those are my first thoughts.
So, as you point out, this transition towards a post-carbon future is happening at the same time as a very intensive conversation about the future of the global order, particularly this kind of idea, this dispute between global north and global south about whether we're kind of heading towards a bipolar future, of a Western coalition and China, or a multipolar future, which, many in the global south tend to favor. So that's happening on top of all of this climate anxiety and on top of the, different moves by external development partners to try and kind of help to step into a space where they can work with Africa in order to achieve a green transition. So I was wondering how you bring those two together. Like, how do you think all of this kind of cooperation in relation to a green transition is going to affect the geopolitics of multipolarity in Africa and the world?
So I'll start with the geoeconomics, and in some ways I will reserve the political for last. I have been working on understanding two key trends. So one trend is the circular economy, where we are emphasizing taking less virgin or primary materials out of the ground. So I'm not sure if you've been following, but there is now a huge groundswell of interest among technologies all over the world in recycling to a degree that has never been possible before. Part of that because of new capabilities. So most people are not aware, but copper, for instance, retains its characteristics almost to a degree, about 90%, with multiple recycling phases. So what that means, therefore, is you could potentially, depending on some dynamics, stop mining copper in a couple of years by simply refining the copper that has already been mined. That is also connected with this whole new idea of landfill mining, where you have very elaborate waste management techniques in the advanced countries. And they track, every type of waste and where it's going. And there's now capabilities to refine that waste and to generate wealth out of that waste. So historically, what is interesting is that this circular economy is often held up as a more equitable future. But my analysis shows that the countries that have polluted the least and therefore have the least waste also have another problem. They have the least valuable waste. So if you think of waste in Ghana, for instance, it's primarily organic, and the inorganic parts of the waste in Ghana does not contain a lot of valuable minerals. So compared to, say, Belgium, it's very difficult to set up recovery mechanisms in Ghana to extract precious minerals. In Belgium, on the other hand, because of all the electronic waste, of high value electronic waste, it's now commercially viable to spend your time investing in landfill mining and to try and extract valuable materials and resources from waste landfills. That means that when you think of, all the geopolitical concerns around the control of rare earth metals and other minerals by China, and the fact that in some instances, the parts of Africa where we are finding some of these new minerals have tended to be more favorable to non-Western investors than to Western investors because of, increased globalization of Western norms of enforcement in the areas of corruption and money laundering and anti-terrorism and all of these things. It's meant that investors from the Gulf, from China, from India, etc., are perhaps going to do better in securing concessions to those critical minerals in those parts of Africa where they occur. And that means that it makes a lot of sense to invest a lot of money to recover secondary materials in the West than to try and fight over those resources in Africa or elsewhere, Latin America and elsewhere. But that also then means that over time, you're going to see less demand for these minerals, because as the recycling technology gets very good in Europe, you see that technology also shifted to Asia. And then while China may be happy to do the best it can to secure concessions, it'd rather not have to worry, right? So we will also see recycling capacity in those places. We are going therefore to see significant stranding of these mines in Africa in the next decade or so, because recycling is going to get so good that new lithium and new nickel production will only be to cover the gap between recycled materials and demand. So that is one problem that I think very few people are observing or taking note of. This connection between advanced material science and the geopolitics of access to critical minerals. They don't marry very well. As the science gets better and better in terms of recovery, in terms of newer forms of material, reconstruction of material, the material base of technology, such as electronics and the rest of it, the geopolitics and the unfavorable nature of the geopolitics means that we're going to see more attempts not to convert primary raw materials into finished products. So that is a very important trend that I think is being widely missed in the debate. The second one, and I think enough people don't pay attention to the fact that we now have a very interesting complex of consulting companies, of academic institutions, of think tanks and the like that have created this knowledge superstructure, which is very important if you want to open new domains of the economy anywhere in the world. So in Africa, the West has traditionally been much more effective in managing these type of complexes. So if you think of the traditional World Bank program, you will see that the material contracts, the road building and the rest, if the country decides to get involved in that kind of activity, will tend to go to the Chinese and the rest. But the design of the program, its interfacing with social innovation, the rest of it tends to favor consulting companies and the like who are mostly Western. The Chinese, the Gulf players and the rest have not done too well when it comes to competing in that terrain. So the thought leadership is still predominantly very Western. And that has been a challenge for China. China has tried very hard to do the deal making in a way that, to its mind, favors African elites. The problem is that the way that these programs now run is you need some engagement with the bureaucracy, and it requires more than just, signing deals. You have to be on the ground to help actually implement these programs. And the way that in the West that has happened is this complex of consulting companies, think tanks, thought leaders, influencers, working together to advance the Western view of the world, even when they don't know that they're doing that. And I think the Chinese are nowhere near, the Russians are nowhere near, the Gulf are nowhere near in understanding that dynamic on the ground. So there is a lot of talk about, how they secure access to resources and how they play the game and how the multipolar world will evolve. But I don't think that the rest of the world outside the West and the global North are doing very well on the thought leadership frontier. And to that extent, my view is that, yes, at the material level, at the very practical level of access to resource and the rest, we are heading towards, in the beginning, some kind of China-led coalition that tries to confront Western hegemony. But that coalition is very fragmented because it doesn't really have within it clear and cohesive intellectual tradition that self-perpetuates, whereas the West does. Because you see, when you think of how decisions are made around what is a polycrisis, for instance, and how to respond to it, and a lot of that, the assumption is that it's a global debate, but a lot of it is really driven by Western lenses and Western frameworks. And I don't see the Chinese, the Russians, the rest of them working towards some kind of cohesive agenda around that. They are too fragmented, they are too diverse, and the West is much more homogeneous than most people think. And so in that sense, you will see a fragmented attempt at a coalition in the global South, but I don't see that coalition being very effective as a bulwark. On the material side, however, in terms of deal making, access to resources, cutting the deals, competition among different investors and the rest, I do see the emergence of a multipolar arrangement very soon. One that is plurilateral, and that will, in a way, further undermine the multilateral world order as well, because you will have the grand normative structure, how we should do things. You have that heavily dominated by the West. But on the ground, where we are talking about material deal making, we're talking about how to secure access to resources, global South actors would tend to ignore it, whereas the conversation at the multilateral level will still continue to persist that way. And that is very fascinating because it means that the multilateral organizations like the UN institutions, the World Bank and the rest are going to continue losing influence because despite the dominance of the conversation on the ground, there will be a massive disconnect as to what really happens on the ground.
Okay, so the West still has a very cohesive approach to knowledge production. China is weak in this space. The thing that I was waiting to hear you talk about is where is Africa? And you are in this space, and it's one of the areas that I've been especially critical of African policymakers, especially regarding China over the past 20 years. They've had 2 decades now of heavy Chinese engagement in the continent. And over those past 20 years, they've had an opportunity to have 60, 70,000 African young people go to China, study, get advanced degrees, learn Mandarin. But oftentimes those people come back into their home countries and don't make it into the government because they're not from the right tribe, they're not from the right political family, they're not from the right political party, and so on. And so one of the things that we've noticed is that the knowledge among policymakers of China has not dramatically improved over the past 20 years. And the question that I have is that when you look at the leadership today in so many African countries, it's the same corrupt old men that have been there for 20 effing years. And yet you have this dynamic population that is young and that is demanding change. You saw it in Zambia. We even saw the hope in Nigeria. And yet the old men continue to win. And Ali Bongo, the president of Gabon, is in Beijing this week. And you think to yourself, my God, how long has that family been in power? Okay? And it just makes me think about the knowledge production. Where is the African voice in all of this? People like you to kind of say, okay, I'm going to push the Chinese to the side. I'm going to push the Americans and the Europeans to the side. And we're going to carve our path.
Yeah, I mean, you make some very perceptive points, some provocative arguments. So on the one hand, we do have a period of democracy with African characteristics being the most dominant form of political organization on the continent. So the likes of the Bongo family, the likes of the Yadama family and the like, they are definitely in the minority and shrinking fast. What we do have is this unresolved tension between Africa that when it says, Western type democracy is not for us, the truth is people are actually asking for more democracy as opposed to less democracy, which is very strange. So they say that, offhandedly.
Well, it's not strange because young people like this. They want democracy. They want choices. They want the flexibility.
Exactly. But they want hyper democracy, right? Which is the challenge because that becomes very quickly populism, right? So if you could see what is happening in Mali or Burkina Faso right now, or even in Sudan, our voices have to count all the time. And there isn't enough patience for the institutional aspects of things, right? So that is what you might call a hyper-democracy edge. This need for constant conversation, radical politics, constantly negotiating, So in Ghana, I'm not sure if you've been following, but we have this radical call for a new constitution, but that's just the start. It's mostly to agitate the public administration. But the real need is for young people wanting, in a way, they want some kind of permanent emergency, this constant request for engagement. But I think there is less of an interest in institution building, which is the boring side of democracy. Western democracy did not begin with the French Revolution in that sense, right? Nor did it begin with the Glorious Revolution in the UK, which is more on the institutional side. But generally, what has happened is that you've had this parallel trend of hyper-democratic instincts, some of which have led to communist takeovers in some African countries in the past that has not themselves. Like you saw what happened under Mengistu in Ethiopia, where you had a very hyper-democratic group that became very quickly a dictatorship on its own. So I think we have to marry the demand for mass participation with institution building. Institution building, unfortunately, is a highly intellectual game, as you pointed out. And it does require a kind of elite that is somehow still responsive. So kind of an insurgent elite, an elite that emerges big, but they are a bit like the independence movement. So the independence movement was not in anywhere in Africa a mass movement. It wasn't an agrarian revolution, for instance. It wasn't trade union led, for instance. And all of it was insurgent elites who were intent on supplanting Western colonialists. But they were insurgent in the sense that they did have, the society's interests at heart, and they did have a new vision for society and things like that. My challenge is that you're right. that, those of us that are in the think tank space and the rest of it and should be providing this insurgent elitism don't really do very well at it. Part of it is because, in a way, there is a huge gap between us and those that are calling for mass participation. And both of us are fairly weak. And the dominant system is a kind of policy that is very much an attempt to reflect pre-colonial, unresolved pre-colonial issues around the place of various ethnic groups and their nationalist identity in politics. So if you go to Nigeria, for instance, unresolved issues around East, Southwest, or Southeast, Southwest, Northwest, North Central continue to be the dominant driving force of politics. So these are pre-colonial problems that were never fully resolved, and then there was independence, and people are stuck in that time warp. So if you are stuck in that time warp, the insurgent elites versus those that are pushing for mass participation, the new activist fringes, those that have large youth movements, are relatively much weaker. So go to Uganda, and you think of the people that are following Bobby Wine, and you think that they are the majority. No, they're not really the majority. The majority in the rural areas in Uganda and the rest are still living in a time warp, which is very much focused on maintaining of local allegiances and the structures of, now I won't say tribal, because it's not always tribal, but allegiances that are primal and primordial. And so that is the problem, I think, in Africa, which is that the degree of fragmentation between those that could potentially become some kind of knowledge vanguard and those that are still living in a certain pre-colonial time warp, and those matters have not been fully resolved. And the hope was, with increasing infrastructure, with increasing availability of resources so that nutrition and things like that are solved, people naturally then move on to ask bigger questions. And that has also not happened too well. Why? Because industrialization failed in the 60s and 70s. And we never really understood fully why it failed and never really bothered to do the diagnosis. So we didn't even have the Vietnam, the Thailand experience of at least some degree of industrial transformation, which then paved the path for an industrial society to emerge. So in the absence of an industrial society that is still primarily traditional, now we build on top of that this capitalist sheen of informal economies and everybody selling things on the roadside and things like that. That opens the door for some kind of mass participation in urban areas. And then you have the divide between those kind of people that are asking for this hyper-democratic movements and then the rural areas who are still primarily stuck in a colonial time warp. So my view is very simple. There has to be a recognition that the conditions for some kind of independent African strategy when it comes to dealing with China, we are better off if we could potentially delegate that to some kind of Pan-African structure within the AU system that has legitimacy with the Pan-African elite, however small it is, to come up with something that then gets domesticated in local legislation over time, than to think that some organic movement out of Africa, just come up with a how does Africa engage China kind of thing. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think so. The way that thought movements, schools of thought, have emerged in the West, like the Frankfurt schools and the rest of it, has been at the basis of institutions that have significant spread and remit. So if you think of the Frankfurt School and you think of the range of institutions that help to fuel it and to water it, we don't have the equivalent in Africa. I mean, Makerere and a few of them have some prominence, but long gone. And even when they did, it was very restricted to small parts of Africa. So I don't see an organic school of thought emerge that becomes a thought movement that can shape Africa's engagement with China. But there could be formal institutions around the African Union that perhaps can attempt something like this. And then countries then are asked to ratify them into domestic legislation, for instance, as a possibility.
So, Cobus, I want to bring up a point that Bright just raised about this question of industrialization. And I want to go back to a conversation that you and I had earlier this week. Bright, I had a chat, a realization actually, on Monday of this week that the business that we are running at the China Global South Project is potentially facing extinction. And I plugged in, and I'm totally serious about this. I wrote an article about Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, going to Vietnam last weekend, and that was for our Monday newsletter. And then all I put into Google Bard, and Google Bard is Google's AI engine like ChatGPT, was Antony Blinken visit to Vietnam. And the blood drained from my head because it was about 85% as good as the article that I wrote. Okay? And I'm a journalist of 35 years experience. I've been working for CNN, for BBC, for AP, for all over the place. And here, Google Bard in 3 seconds came up with an article that was, not as good as mine, but really close. So I talked to Cobus and I brought up this point and I said, holy crap, we have to really start thinking about our business and how we're going to reinvent ourselves. And then I brought up the point that I'm here in Vietnam, where so much of the industrialization that Africa so desperately wants is really starting to take place. The whole China plus one strategy is beautiful for Southeast Asia. Companies are moving more of their supply chains out of China. They're diversifying into Southeast Asia. But when you think about what the machines are going to be able to do, not 10 years from now, not 15 years from now, next year, where the machines can think and the machines will be able to assemble at a pace that humans would never be able to keep up with. And Cobus and I got into this somewhat heated conversation where I said at one point, I think Africa is going to get left behind on this. I don't think every continent and every region is entitled to follow the same development trajectory that Southeast Asia followed. That is what happened here, where they went from agrarian to semi-industrial to, industrial, and then they become Japan, right? There's no guarantee that you get to do that. And then Cobus brought up, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Cobus, because then I'd like to get Bright's take on our discussion, that there is potential biases in that statement. So why don't you pick up our discussion from there?
In the first place, I think there's no way of, just in terms of the impact of AI itself, there's no way of separating AI from dominant cultures. So one of the things that, came up in our discussion is just the way that AI, these kind of AI generated accounts of something like Blinken's visit already packs in certain kind of geopolitical biases, because this technology is fed on pre-existing biased and, kind of directed framed coverage. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that, and this, like Bright, I'd like to ask your opinion about this, is, do you think that the way that we've seen development happen over the last 150 years, in the Western countries and then in Asia and so on, is that the only direction that development can happen in? And for example, is there a way for Africa to kind of lean into its massive, natural resources, particularly its solar potential, to lean into its potential status as a global agricultural power, to map other forms of development? Like, is there an African form of development that we just haven't found yet? Like, how optimistic are you, like, that there's a way for Africa to take hold of its youth dividend and these other benefits and actually reshape what development itself means?
Fascinating, Cobus. Really fascinating conversation. So a number of, like the whole of this conversation has been so far, is a number of thematic highlights that we then have to bring together. So one, you are right. The Danny Rodricks of this world have spent, tons of paper trying to figure out this whole issue of late stage industrialization and that challenge, and specifically as it applies to places like Africa. And yes, Africa's labor advantages don't really stand out. If you want to hire an engineer or a technician of the same requisite skill as you will find in Vietnam, Philippines, or India, you're going to pay way more. And we actually have seen, even in IT, companies that were beginning to grow in Africa start to increasingly rely on information technology professionals in Eastern Europe, in India, and elsewhere, which is kind of frightening because that information technology space was one of the places that we thought Africa had a natural advantage. A lot of young, English-speaking, highly bright people. And the idea was that we're going to create all of these massive IT centers. And we know that the story of business process outsourcing in Africa is of almost universal failure. Ghana's last major BPO center closed almost a decade ago, I think. Maybe 8 years.
And why is that? What's the reason for the failure?
Well, we don't have the cost advantages that we think we do. So one, the talent is not that cheap in Africa. People think because we have a lot of young people and the rest of it, somehow the talent is cheap. But when you adjust for the output, the productivity level. Yeah, you just find out that African professionals are not very cheap. And startups are finding that too. They're finding out that, okay, a lot of the very good Africans trained in international universities, as is natural because they are competing in a global space. Technology is a global space. So you don't want to think you can hire somebody from local who doesn't have the right skill set and build a technology platform and try and sell that to a factory. If that factory can easily get something that was made in Croatia, in 30 minutes. So you have to hire the best, and the best in Africa tend to be expensive for various reasons. One is that a lot of them have to go overseas for training, which can be very costly. So if you think of how much it costs someone in Croatia to earn an IT degree of, almost comparable quality to somebody in the US, maybe a few thousands of euros. The same African probably has to then go do a master's in Imperial College or somewhere like that and costs like $100,000, even after accounting for scholarships and the likes of it. So Africa is really disadvantaged in terms of this lack of a historical, vocational, technical skills conferring infrastructure, with something that Eastern Europe has in abundance because of the Soviet period. So we have all these challenges around training highly talented professionals being very costly. People like David Indy in Kenya are now arguing that we should forget about industrialization altogether for this reason. Our comparative advantage is not in labor, our comparative advantage is in land. And even there, I think that he makes a mistake because he's talking about Kenya, so in that sense, he's probably right up to a point. I think for the rest of Africa, I don't even think the comparative advantage in land is very true because we are primarily a desert continent, right, with some grassland in the south and a very small equatorial forest, which is fast shrinking. Ghana has lost 90% of its equatorial forest in the last century. So Africa is not really a very naturally endowed continent as most people think. I remember not a few years ago looking at most of the geological data sets, still very much US, British, and some held in Asia, and finding out, to my surprise, that Africa is one of the most mineral poor continents in the world. And so these are frightening kind of facts, but not to drift too off and to come back to the issue around AI and industrialization. Key points. One is that we have a cost disadvantage in labor, which is important, particularly skilled labor. And so that is a challenge. Number two is the fact that unlike in the Asian situation, when Asia was industrializing, the global supply chain structure did not really favor a lot of other considerations beyond pure cost saving. Now, so many other considerations, just-in-time manufacturing and so many other factors around supply chains have meant that the wholesale outsourcing model is not viable anymore anyway. Third, we have massive competition from other late-stage industrializing countries who have figured it out better than Africa has in Southeast Asia and the rest. So it's very difficult to suspect that companies, if they can't do it in China, will not go to the Philippines first until the Philippines had their fill, and then Thailand and all of these countries. So that's all of those factors have been, exhaustively analyzed. But I think there are others that are not as well known, and that is that manufacturing itself is becoming increasingly servified, by which we mean services in manufacturing are increasingly more valuable and increasingly more important. So if you look at and that is twinned with another point, which is that services themselves are becoming much more sophisticated, sometimes to a greater degree than manufacturing. Manufacturing is actually becoming simpler because of automation. And so if you think of the skills that you need nowadays to build a radio, to set up a radio building company versus what you need to do Amazon fulfillment is way ahead in terms of the managerial skills you need, in terms of the kind of people you need to hire to build the processes and the rest of it. So that is changing what we mean by manufacturing, because if you go to the UK, for instance, and you went out into Kent and you went into Dartford and you saw the Amazon fulfillment centers there, and then you went to somewhere in Vietnam and you saw a textile factory there is absolutely no assumption that somehow that manufacturing plant in Vietnam or elsewhere matches in terms of what a fulfillment center in Amazon means. And that's even before Amazon has fully automated, right? So what that means, therefore, is that we have to think more broadly than just manufacturing when we think of industrialization, right? We have to think of logistics. We have to think of just-in-time demand fulfillment. We have to think about high degrees of customization and personalization in delivery. All of these things are powerful new trends around how you do higher productivity outputs. So essentially, forget about manufacturing per se and think about what are all the areas in the economy where you need more advanced productivity, where you need higher skills, where you can create a lot of jobs, where you can create a lot of well-paying jobs. Because one of the advantages of manufacturing was that in taking people from the agrarian and subsistence level to living in cities and in a more modern lifestyle. Manufacturing was great because it provided just enough wages that people could actually do that transition. And most other economies in the service industries were not. But that's because in the service industry in Africa, it's still stuck in 1900, right? We're still literally selling things on tabletops. But it's a whole range of service industry areas which could create a lot of jobs and allow for skills to emerge. So then that question then becomes, what is it about manufacturing that continues to dominate mindsets? And I think part of that challenge has been not understanding the overall shift in economic behavior and economic patterns, and therefore focused on manufacturing things, even when the rest of the ecosystem is not ready to support the kind of manufacturing that nowadays makes sense. So I think that's one big challenge. And the last point around AI is that we have to recognize these trends in AI. One is that there are now bets being made about different pathways in AI, and those bets have huge meaning, right? In the sense that this move now towards generative and synthetic media creation and large language models, because ChatGPT broke through and it's now in the public consciousness. But people are not paying attention to how much less progress is being made in robotics. So I was recently looking at Mitsubishi, Honda, and all of these companies and their latest reports, and we are really stuck on robotics. Even in large language models, we have benchmark saturation and lack of progress on some models, which appears to be peaking. But still, there's huge room for growth because at least they've beaten human baseline in most of the areas. So the baseline performance around sentence construction, around grammatic. So one of the things that excites you about ChatGPT or BARD is that the grammar is perfect and you can't write perfect grammar at first go. So those kind of things, they're already outperforming humans. But on robotics, they're still struggling. So some of the automation gains.
But it's only a matter of time, though, right? I mean, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Yeah, but when you talk to them, when you look at their own projections and the rest, it's not looking too good on robotics in terms of the mass. So China is the most robotized society on earth. And even they are struggling to increase the degree of automation in factories. So that's one thing, which is important. The second thing, which I've already pointed out, as you pointed out, is that yes, individual discrete AI areas, the machines are beating us already, and they will continue to beat us. What is important, and this is where my work comes in, is how you integrate the discrete capabilities into connected wholes. And these connected wholes is what defines economic output. So in essence, it's not about whether or not you can make a good robot individually that behaves like a human being. It's whether or not in your manufacturing ecosystem, you can plant robots and then have the servicing capabilities and all of those things work together in such a way that you end up delivering cheaper. So I've been looking at, say, Walmart versus Amazon, and Amazon is ahead in terms of automation versus Walmart. But on some of the e-commerce benchmarks, Walmart is really giving Amazon a run for its money. In fact, it's outperforming Amazon on many benchmarks. A very simple example. You walk in any shop now in the US or Europe, and checkout has been primarily automated. You go there and you walk in and you scan your things and you move out. But that does not fundamentally change things like stacking shelves, right? Because you've been able to do one discrete automating function. What will be interesting is the degree to which overall that retail front end experience completely gets automated, and that requires integrations. It's becoming evident that is very hard. It's becoming hard to do because you have multiple vendors, you have multiple requirements at different levels of the chain, etc. So my simple summary is that rather than look at discrete capabilities, so can it produce perfect articles, think about the editorial process as a whole. And consider whether or not it knows how to find sources, it knows how to weigh some of the sources better than others, it knows how to treat confidentiality. And those, when you now think of all and say, okay, yeah, I can write an AI that can do each of those things very well. When I now have to put it together to create a modern automated newsroom, it's a completely different conversation.
It is, but we never imagined that it would be where it is today. So I'm just keeping the options open that it's going to evolve very quickly, much faster than we...
Yes, Eric, but remember that is for the in-between. Connecting the things are not AI, right? Connecting the things are human institutions and our management capability. So it will not grow at the same pace as the individual AI thing. So producing an article is one thing, figuring out how to manage better audiences, right? Or how to get it before more audiences. It's not an AI problem per se at this stage.
No.
And that is the difference.
I'm glad you brought up economist David Ndii. And for those of you not familiar with David Ndii, he's a very well-known Kenyan economist, quite controversial in his views. People either love him or hate him. I find him very, very interesting. Earlier this year or late last year, I forget when it was, he wrote a very interesting article saying that Kenya, and I think by Kenya he was also referring to some other African countries, made a very bad bet by investing so heavily. And really what I mean by investing is taking out massive loans from the Chinese and others to build hard infrastructure. And he said instead what Kenya and other countries should have done is follow the example of here in Southeast Asia, where, and I can attest the fact that Vietnam's infrastructure is really not good. And in fact, when I go to Africa, I see the infrastructure in Africa, I oftentimes go, wow, this is better than what we have in Vietnam. And instead in Vietnam, what they've done, and also elsewhere in Southeast Asia, is invest in human capital development, education, social services, healthcare, literacy. And when I hear you talking about the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, I wonder about this gap that is starting to form between the information haves, the education haves, and the information and education have-nots. And I see that in my son's education, where, you know, he's in a very nice private school and they're doing robotics at 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And then by the time you get to high school, they're already coding at a pretty advanced level. And you wonder, will there ever be an opportunity for people at the bottom half of the pyramid to catch up to the top? And this goes to Cobus's question about, is there another way? Because I'm starting to see that this gap between the top elites, the wealthy few who have access to this privileged education and knowledge, is almost too large to close. And so what happens to 1 billion people who don't have the opportunities for education, who are being pushed aside by automation, and they're up against all these other challenges burdened down by climate change and whatnot? That is a challenge that is very, very pressing in many African countries today. Can you kind of reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, and Eric, as always, you ask really profound questions. I think, obviously, we have an epistemic apartheid where, some of the areas that matter to our lives are now so hyper-specialized that not only do you need a good education to do it, you also need incredible levels of stamina and leisure, available leisure that's paid for by somebody else in order to grasp it. And that is why the likes of, Google, Microsoft, and the rest are spending so much money creating these structures in which people and how they think is not linked directly to any economic factor or output per se. So you look at DeepMind, you look at all the different structures that Microsoft had to put together and how OpenAI started. You find out that one of the things that they're trying to achieve is to create this environment where people can just think and not have to somehow justify their thinking in relation to economic outcomes for the organization. So we go back to early medieval era in Europe, and you have these monks shut out in monasteries, preserving knowledge for the rest of society, right? And the rest of society, you have the feudal arrangements and the likes of it for economic production that was highly inefficient, but that was all that mattered. And all of these people that were fighting over scraps of land and titles and the rest of it, all of them are not really important in the larger scheme of things, right? The only thing that was important was all this knowledge from Greece and Rome and the Arab world that these monks somehow managed to squirrel away until we had the Renaissance. And then you had this flourishing of institutions that eventually allowed an industrial revolution to happen in Europe. So the question is not only that whether the education that is being made available is of the right quality, and in many cases not. It's exactly the way you've painted it, which is that the combination of leisure, stimulation, the ability not to have to link your outputs, your thought output directly to economic outcomes, all of those things mean that you have a very small sliver of the population that can grapple with any of the matters that are of importance. So it's a bit like, let's say you go to 17th century Europe, not 17th century, let's say 16th century Europe, and the vast majority of people, 99.999%, don't understand the universe in which they live. They still live on a flat earth. They don't understand that, the earth orbits the sun. And in a way, that is the kind of society we still live in on the issues that matter. Whether it's AI, whether it's genomics, whether it's how regulation actually works in deciding what medicines you get, whether it's how trade systems work and what rules of origin means. The average person is 99.99% blind about all the things that matter to them. So that is the nature of the world we live in. And I think the implications are not merely for whether or not that then creates inequalities in the economic sphere. I think it also creates fascinating things, as we are seeing in politics, with the rise of populism and simple explanations that account for every factor out of relevance to ordinary people, because otherwise the alternative is for them to forego their means of life and their means of livelihoods and go and try and grapple with what is the connection between 5G and COVID-19. So in a world in which you can't take off a couple of weeks just to better improve your knowledge about how 5G might potentially be connected to COVID-19, it's easy if somebody has a simple explanation for you on the web. So we are seeing some things, but it's not new. I think it's basically a re-emergence of what happened in Europe in the medieval era and the rise towards some degree of broad literacy. The problem is that the knowledge is escalating so fast at such an exponential level that I don't see how broad literacy returns. So in this world, maybe the solution is the AI thing, right? Because then if everybody at least has a facility that allows something to think for them very quickly, then we can still create this modern world where the average person can at least pretend to be literate. So rather than, this idea of AI being imitative, I think eventually we're going to see humans trying to imitate knowledge, not AI imitating knowledge, because the average person just cannot grapple with the sheer complexity of the world they live in.
We recently spoke with Kevin Gallagher from Boston University, and he made the point that in order for Africa to deal with this kind of double whammy of development gaps and a climate crisis, there's going to have to be massive writing off of African debt. So he was talking around like $500 billion. And so I was wondering kind of how you look at the next 10 years or so, like how you see this kind of development climate financing nexus developing over the next while. You recently wrote a fascinating article on your website, like looking at the interactions between African governments and the World Bank, and kind of and some of the kind of disconnects between them, which frequently means that that even if there is money available, the money can't actually be disbursed. So I was wondering, kind of like how you see what kind of choices Africa should be making over the next 10 years or so in order to deal with these kind of massive compound crises.
Good. Cobus. So first point, I think the big climate finance conundrum is whether Africa is competitive for polluting industries or is competitive for green industries. Because which direction you slant has huge econometric implications for how you do your analysis going forward. If you think that, in a world that is increasingly overregulated, industries might have to shift to places like Africa that somehow fight for an enclave of lower regulation, and that becomes a transitional belt into the future, then you might argue that, the future could be bright if African policymakers, are assertive in saying, look, we will welcome, carbon-intensive industries for the next 20 years. And in that period, we will use that as reparative for all the historical non-pollution that we've been responsible for. So essentially, we are taking our per capita share of pollution and we're converting that to money. And yes, so that is one way you can look at things. The other way you can look at things is say, look, we've got this massive Sahara and Kalahari belt, and that is potentially great for solar panel. Though there's some confusion there because solar panel is really about incident light, and it's not always the case that it's about just how much the sun, the heat of the sun or anything like that. But anyway, if somehow you say, look, Africa is very competitive for green because we have this massive solar resource, and therefore we're going to attract companies that want cheaper renewable energy, that could also affect the way you think. The way I would think about it as someone that has, is inclined towards the political economy of things, is that it's perhaps the case that green energy requires more advanced institutional arrangements. In essence, to build a green economy in your part of the world, you need more advanced institutions. And therefore, it's less likely that Africa will be able to green. But whether or not that then means that companies are willing to send carbon-intensive industry will depend on specific policies. The second point, which is then about money, how to unlock the money, is exactly what you've said, which is that right now, the problem is not, money per se, though, of course, we still need huge volumes of money. The problem immediately is that the monies that are available are not being spent well enough and not being released quickly enough. So you have a problem in many parts of Africa where World Bank programs do not really progress very much. Last time I checked on public sector reform projects funded by the World Bank in Ghana, the majority of the money, the bulk of the money had been used to buy cars for officials. Whereas we have so many institutional areas where we need to improve on outcomes in the judiciary, in the civil service, etc. And very little has been done there. So we have this problem where the money that is available, because the World Bank insists on these very elaborate standards, the African countries couldn't unlock it. 2 decades ago, some of the African countries just forgot about trying to get money from the World Bank IMF system for infrastructure because they just found it too onerous and went for resource-backed loans in China. And then we found out that that was not any simpler because, yes, there is the issue about the standards, but there's also the issue about operational efficiency. And both are a problem. So even when you relax the standards like China tried to do, operational efficiency meant that most of the commitments it made to Ghana, more than $13 billion, could not be fulfilled because they just could not unlock the money. So it's not just with the World Bank and the IMF. Either standards will prevent the money from being unlocked, as we see in the World Bank and IMF, so anti-corruption standards, high procurement standards and the like, or operational efficiency issues will stop the money from being unlocked, as we've seen with the bauxite for infrastructure deal in Ghana. So that is where we are now, Cobus. We have a problem where talking about the money is important, but institutional climates issues also apply or also are relevant. And now, without fixing those institutions in Africa, it's not easy to unlock the money that is available. Now, to talk of committing more money in such a context, to me, is a bit blind, a bit myopic, because we have to do what we can to improve the institutional climate, while at the same time asking for more money. But it has to be done in parallel. And that is what I find missing.
Bright Siemens is the vice president in charge of research at the Accra-based think tank Imani Center for Policy and Education. Bright, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and really helping us to step back and look at these issues from a much more holistic perspective. I mean, you really have a fascinating viewpoint on all these things. If people want to follow what you're reading and writing and to stay on top of your latest thinking, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
2 places. One is my Twitter account, which is @BBSimons, @BBSIMONS. And the second is on my blog, which is www.brightsimons, BRIGHTSIOMONS.com. So those are the 2 places.
And I will put links to both of those in the show notes. Bright, again, you have really opened our eyes on so many of these issues today, so we really appreciate it, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, Cobus, for having me. Very, very appreciative.
Cobus, Bright covered a lot of ground. The subcurrent of so many of his comments related to governance. He didn't talk about governance specifically, but we did talk about it around the periphery and the edges. And that is one of the areas where I see the biggest problem in many African countries. Again, not across the entire continent. That's too broad, too large of a space. But in a number of countries, the ability to navigate through these complex times and these complex relationships with the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, domestic constituencies, the debt, climate change, all of this is a challenge to even the most competent government, even the most well-functioning government. But yet when we have governments that are under-resourced, that are filled with nepotism, that at the same time corruption is rampant in many governments, and I'm thinking specifically of the DR Congo in particular, and many of these family-run administrations, though Bright did note that those are in the minority, so that's an important distinction to make. But governance remains one of the biggest challenges that young people are demanding reform, and I don't see it happening fast enough. Now, when the new leaders came into Angola and Ethiopia a few years ago, there was this hope that there was going to be a change in leadership, more focus on competent leadership, on cleaning up corruption, on improving delivery of services. And I don't get the sense that they have lived up to the expectations of many of those voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a really big problem. It's particularly kind of dispiriting, I think, from a South African perspective, because in a lot of these countries, the governance is held back. As Bright was pointing out, the governance is frequently held back by a lack of institutions, and particularly of like highly competent and highly empowered institutions. But in the case of South Africa had those institutions, and they ended up kind of getting captured and infiltrated by corrupt actors.
But that's the nepotism, the corruption, you are literally the case study for this. I mean, literally the case study.
Yeah. And I think South Africa is going through a very interesting, in the Chinese proverb sense, of really kind of testing not only how these institutions will work, but the very commitment of the electorate to democracy itself. Like, kind of what we've seen over the last while is that, we recently spoke with Joseph Asunka, the head of Afrobarometer, very like the most influential polling outfit in Africa. And he was pointing out that almost everywhere in Africa, enthusiasm about democracy is increasing. The one exception is South Africa, which has a world famous, famously robust democracy and very hard, kind of hard-won democracy. But optimism about democracy and the ability of democracy to deliver results has plummeted in South Africa. And what one sees also as another interesting data point is my partner was recently speaking with executives from Netflix, and they were saying that the people who, like all the media people who are pitching projects, the South Africans who are pitching projects to Netflix, the country is so depressed that all of the projects are so depressing and dark that is actually a problem for them. It's a little snapshot in terms of like where South Africa is psychologically. It's really, really trampled down. And with that then comes this feeling of how are you going to fix this? Kind of how are you going in a country that ostensibly has these institutions. Those institutions are not saving the populace from a set of leaders who are essentially indifferent to human well-being in South Africa. So there's no easy answer here. Kind of Africa has to find its way forward, but I'm not sure how that road runs,
And if you want to see what this actually looks like up front, I cannot recommend enough the 4-part series on Al Jazeera, The Gold Mafia, talking about corruption in Zimbabwe, which also involves quite a few folks in South Africa as well. And it is just depressing to watch it.
One should add that the Western sanctions that have targeted Zimbabwe have only contributed to this problem. This is the sad reality, is that sanctions doesn't help. So like somehow empowering this youth population of Africa, to have some leadership stake is crucial, but how to do it is a big challenge.
And again, I want to be very clear that we're not talking about the entire continent, but we are talking about enough countries where this is a serious problem, and again, not fulfilling the wishes, ambitions, and desires of the young people who are really voting them into office and demanding more of their leaders, and just to provide the opportunities that they so deserve. And again, we're just not seeing it. So governance is a key issue in all of this. We're going to keep our comments now a little bit short because we went a little bit longer than I anticipated with Bright. I do want to let everybody know that next week, we've got a pair of shows scheduled, both on our Global South podcast and then in our Africa show next week, that's going to focus on the debt issue. And what we're going to do is, just as we did with Bright today, is we're going to try and step back and ask, where are we? So much has happened now in the past few weeks with the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, word of breakthroughs with the Chinese on their debts and their opposition to multilateral development banks, and their insistence that the MDBs, namely the World Bank, tank write-offs on their loans. All of that, how is it all playing out? How is it impacting Africa? That's going to be our focus next week, so I hope you will join us. So, Cobus, we're going to leave it there. Of course, if you want to follow everything that we're doing, I really encourage you to join our subscription with the China Global South Project. It's super engaging. You get this great digest every day about what happened the night before from a team of editors in the Global South. We're not sitting in London, in Washington, and New York writing about China and Africa, China in the Middle East, and China in Asia. We're here in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East writing about it. It's a team of independent journalists. We're a nonprofit. We really depend on your support, and we're so grateful to it. If you'd like to support the work that we're doing and all of the great journalists at the China Global South Project, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You can try it out for 30 days free. See if you like it. If you don't, then no worries. You won't be charged, but we do hope that you will, and to support the great work that Cobus and the team are doing. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.